The work, especially of the Africa Land Policy Center, together, and this is works together with the African Union and the Africa Development Bank and ECA. What we did is we have set a target that has been endorsed by African member states. It's a 30% target, so we call it the 30% campaign. And what that means is that member states need to move towards allocating documented rights to women at the rate of 30%. So if Uganda has documented 15% of their land, we need to see that 30% of that is allocated to women. What we want, obviously, is that all the land is documented so that, of course, the rate goes up. But I think the issue here is that women contribute tremendously, especially to the issue of agriculture and other land-based resources, including issues relating to mitigating climate change and looking at how we adapt to climate change. And also, if you want them to enter business, whether it's in agriculture or other fields, you need to empower them. And that's where we start, is where the most productive resources for the continent is, which is obviously land. So we have now this target endorsed by the African Union member states in the context of the Specialized Technical Committee on Agriculture, Rural Development, Environment, obviously, and Water. And so we are tracking that. And what we've done is actually to create some indicators which are also very well linked to tracking Agenda 2063, looking at the 10-year implementation plan, but also the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are working with partners at the global level on that. So very quickly, we have 12 pilot countries where we are working in to make sure that the member states have baselines that will help us to track this target, along with other land governance indicators, of course. And this is one where we think that when we build these systems at country level for collecting data, even countries will see the value of actually engaging on this issue. Women's land rights is a development issue.
Perfect. Now, still on that same point, one of the caveats was that you had to navigate through some laws and long-held customs, whether traditional or legal. So has there been any progress on the same? Is it a two-step forward, three-step back? How have these conversations been?
You're right that the issue of empowerment, you meet some cultural practices that have been long held, and some of them that discriminate against women. So we have, fortunately, been working to develop a forum for agricultural traditional authorities, which we call FATA, and they now have a platform at the continental level where they are engaging on this issue to learn from each other. Number one, understanding the context of land in the broader development agenda. And then number two, looking at what it means to secure women's land rights within their jurisdictions. Remember, almost 90% of Africa's land, they hold it, the traditional authorities. So if you want an impact, that's who you go to. So in terms of allocating land, whether we reach the 30% will greatly depend on what they do. So when there's new land to be allocated, we are looking at them as a partner now to work with us to look at how that land can go in there, women can have control of this land. So working closely with the traditional authorities so that a paramount chief in Ghana extends some knowledge to somebody sitting in Zambia. And looking, number one, it provides that knowledge to them. But broadly, it also serves as a peer. There's a little bit of peer pressure now to see who can beat who. It's not competition really, but it's also looking at how you support governments in the quest for development.
Now, in the larger scheme of things, the free trade area, the land conversation is also a bit, we still haven't grasped the element of it. For example, in Rwanda, if huge investors come to the tune of over a certain amount of millions of dollars, they're allocated a piece of land to get in, and that's the same for different countries. So how convergent are the conversations on land within the free trade area conversation?
Well, yeah, I'm somebody trained in international trade, so it really helps, I think, for me to be able to grasp how land fits into the conversation of CFTA. By the way, CFTA is a great thing to have happened to the continent. So we've been looking at the issue of land in the context of regional integration. The Declaration on Land itself calls on our regional economic communities, for instance, to make sure that land governance issues are entrenched in common protocols that advance issues of investments, that advance issues of trade, that advance issues of agriculture. So what we have been doing, for instance, with ECOWAS, that's where we started, is to look at a framework for harmonization of land policies so that it advances CFTA kinds of goals.
Right.
Okay, how do we integrate as a region? Where does land play a role? We want to boost investments. How are we going to have that? And to have that conversation, they then developed a framework for harmonizing policies, and that then went to the ECOWAS Parliament, and we are looking to see, how we move forward in implementation. Equally, we are also working with IGAD to examine the issue of harmonization. Currently, we are conducting a study looking at the key issues within the region and looking at where there's some convergence to make sure that we advance these issues. The issue of trade. First, yes, you address the domestic element of things, looking at providing land for investments, especially for those countries that have large tracts of land. So looking at the relationships between the smallholders, medium and large scale, to ensure that you have innovative models that allow for smallholders to exist and to evolve by looking at being provided inputs, so looking at the input market side where large-scale farmers can actually assist, but as well as looking at being opened up in terms of markets. So this is where the innovative models approach is looking at. So we have guiding principles that we developed on large-scale land-based investments, once again endorsed by AU member states. And within that, we are looking at what kinds of principles will allow us to benefit financially, economically, while looking at the environmental side to make sure that we can do the impact assessments to make sure that we are sound, but also looking at the socio-cultural side to make sure that nobody's being left behind. The communities are not being disenfranchised. So that's where we start. And remember, I mentioned working with traditional authorities. And we are looking to integrate that knowledge and to learn across countries. So we think that supporting the CFTA starts from actually good land governance at country level, but also looks at regional integration, which we are approaching with our regional economic communities. Looking at the land question, mainstreaming that in the programs of the REX, so that we address those issues together.
One last question, allow me to read here. There was a professor from the president of African Academy of Sciences that talked about cessation of agro-imperialism, right, where massive chunks of Africa's arable land sold to either foreign grabbers or national grabbers. If the continent is supposed to distribute and feed this booming population, we have to address some of these core issues. We know about what happened with the Maasais in Kenya, and let's not talk about how replicable that conversation is across the different countries. What is your view?
Okay, so the issue of what we call the land grab is not new to us, right? There was land grabs before colonization, okay, cessation, grabbing of land from communities where you fight and you grab some land and women and cows. But I think that the first crumble of Africa obviously was a colonization, and that constitutes a land grab. And then after that, we have different kinds of land grab. What we prefer to do is to say you can have land acquisitions, and then it can either become an investment or a grab, depending on how responsible you are in providing a framework for that investment. So we are promoting responsible investments. And like I mentioned, the guiding principles will provide about 6 fundamental principles and 19 supportive principles that will help us to really do this. So we are providing capacities to do this. So in the context of especially indigenous communities, it's interesting because most of the land that we think is free for investments is actually land that is claimed by indigenous communities. It's not documented rights. It's in the realm of customary land management. So number one, there's the issue of we need to be able to document rights, even if they are community rights. So it's not always individual rights. So once you document that community has rights to land, you protect it even from the state itself. Right. And then beyond that is how you make land effectively utilized to benefit those communities. In some cases, it's the community setting land aside for investments, and they invite internal as well as domestic and external investors. But how they negotiate that. So we have training that we are conducting, for instance, for negotiators, the legal negotiators who help chiefs, who help governments, who help private sector, to look at how the balance can be made. And ensuring that local communities are part of that conversation. We have many countries where they have put frameworks to be able to include local communities in that conversation. So once you document the right, most probably the person that is, or the community who has that claim will be at the table. But if you don't document, most probably they'll be left behind.